The mystifying death of Bubbles Schroeder. Within days of her murder, everyone had heard of Bubbles Schroeder. But why did her death affect such unprecedented public interest? For one thing, she was young and desirable. She was also what was euphemistically called a good time girl. And of course she was dead. But was there something else, something less tangible? Perhaps it was that too many people, she typified the new post-war age, a world of fast cars, fast living, and easy virtue. Jacoba Bubbles Schroeder was born in Lichtenburg on 8 June 1931. She was educated at Benoni Vereniging. When she was 4 years old, her mother had to go out to work, and she was cared for by a cousin in Vereniging until she was 13. For the next 4 years, she lived with her mother in Johannesburg. Then in March 1948, she returned to Vereniging to work for a co-agency, but unbeknown to her relatives, she moved back to Johannesburg 2 months later. Soon after her return to the city, she moved into an apartment of a 52-year-old bookmaker named Philip Steyn, whom she had met at a dense orange grove. Although Steyn liked having Bubbles around, he soon realized that his new guest could sometimes be a lot more trouble than he had bargained for. Bubbles was in the habit of throwing a tantrum when she couldn't get her way. She was a young woman, a little loose in her morals, Steyn said, but she was very sweet, except when she was drunk. Then she became unmanageable. Matters finally came to a head early in June 1949. Bubbles had come to work drunk once too often, and Steyn asked her to leave. Shortly after this, she moved to a Dorchester Mansions in Rosiek Street, where she shared an apartment with a girlfriend named Mrs. Griffin, who was a hostess. Although Bubbles never held down a regular job in all the time she was living in Johannesburg, she was never short of money. Nor was there a dearth of men willing to pay for the pleasure of her company. Bubbles was a glamour girl, Mrs. Griffin would say. She'd spend her day at the beauty parlor and her nights at the nightclubs, and she could be most chaining until she had a few drinks in her, of course. Then she became obstinate and difficult. On Thursday 11th, August 1949, Morris Belchik visited Dorchester Mansions. He made a date with Bubbles for the following Saturday night, and the two duly went out together. At the end of the evening, they went back to Belchik's home and spent the night together. On the following Monday morning, Belchik boasted on his conquest to his friend, David Poliak, who was 21 at the time. At lunchtime, the two men visited Bubbles at her apartment. The plan was that she would get hold of her girlfriend Penny, and the four of them could go out together that night. Unfortunately, Penny was nowhere to be found. In the end, they decided to simply make up a threesome. After Belchik and Poliak had left, Bubbles went to visit Philip Steyn. She spent the afternoon at his apartment, where she had a few glasses of brandy, and then returned at home at 6 p.m. When she reached Dorchester Mansions, Belchik and Poliak were already waiting for her. She apologized for keeping them waiting and invited them inside, while she changed into a green dress and put on some makeup. Around 7:30 p.m., they set out for Poliak's house, Hlatikulu, in the plush suburbs of Ilovo. Poliak's mother was in Durban at the time, so the three of them had the house virtually to themselves. Bubbles traveled with David Poliak, while Belchik took his own car. They reached the house at about 8 o'clock, just as Poliak's cousin, Hyman Balfour Liebman, who was 20 at the time, was leaving for Houghton to pick up his girlfriend. Poliak and Belchik invited Liebman to bring his girlfriend back to the house to join the party, but Liebman declined. They had already arranged to go to the cinema for the evening. After Liebman had driven off, the other three went into the house. Poliak asked Irene to cook, to prepare some food, and at about 9:30 p.m., they sat down to eat a meal of tinned asparagus soup, followed by chops with chips. For dessert, they had a can of tinned peaches. Afterwards, they went into the living room. Bubbles drank a few glasses of brandy and snacked from a tin of peanuts. At about 11:15 p.m., Belchik left for home. It seemed obvious to him that Bubbles and Poliak wanted to be left alone. After Belchik had left, Bubbles and Poliak cleared up in the living room. then went upstairs to listen to records on Poliak's bedroom. Not long afterwards, Belchik phoned. Jealousy, it seemed, had finally got to the better of him. First he spoke to Bubbles, then he apologized to Poliak for disturbing them. After about 15 minutes, he rang off. Around midnight, Heyman Liebman returned to his cinema date. Although he lived in the Brits district, he often stayed at Hlatikulu when Mrs. Poliak was away. Poliak met him in hallway and told him that Bubbles was in his room. The trouble was that she'd had too much to drink and he wanted to get her home before she passed out. Liebman went upstairs to see for himself. It was clear to him, he later said, that Bubbles had been drinking, but she was far from drunk. She insisted on having another drink. Eventually, Liebman got her a glass of weak brandy. At about 12:30 a.m., Bubbles suddenly wanted to go home. Her mother was staying with her, she said, and expected her back by 1 a.m. Eventually, at 1:30 a.m., the three of them walked out into the driveway where the cars were parked. Poliak wanted to take her home, but she got into Liebman's car and wouldn't get out. In the end, Liebman offered to drive her home, and with Bubbles complaining that she wanted to drive, they set out for Dorchester Mansions. 15 to 20 minutes later, Liebman pulled back in the driveway. This time, he was alone. The girl's a lunatic, he told his friend. She wanted to drive, and when I wouldn't let her, she made me stop and got out. I told her to be sensible, but she wouldn't listen. Poliak was angry. You mean you let her walk? Where did you let her out? He asked. At the Dunkeld bus terminus. And did she say anything? Liebman nodded. Yes, she said which way to town. I told her to follow the bus wires along Oxford Road. The last thing she said to me was, "You'll be surprised to read about my corpse in the morning papers." Don't you realize what can happen to the girl? Shouted Poliak. Yes, of course I do, his friend snapped. But at this time of the night, I didn't think she'd come to any harm. Liebman was tired and fed up. I'm going to bed, he added, and went to the house. Poliak was worried about Bubbles. Although it was nearly 2 a.m., he set off in his own car and tried to find her. About an hour later, he returned home. Bubbles Schroeder had vanished. The two young men assumed that Bubbles had managed to get a lift with the passing motorist. Neither of them dreamt anything was wrong until Morris Belchik phoned Poliak at work the next day. The morning Belchik had called at Dorchester Mansions to see Bubbles, but had learned from her mother that she hadn't returned home from her night out. Soon after he had heard these news, Poliak went to see Mrs. Schroeder himself. Later, Belchik, Poliak and Mrs. Schroeder drove down to Rosebank Police Station to report that Bubbles was missing. Poliak also telephoned the General Hospital to see if she had been admitted there. Bubbles Schroeder's body was discovered 30 hours after her death at Birdhaven Plantation by Samuel and Gibisa Mobela. The plantation was less than a kilometer from the spot where Liebman claimed to have dropped her off. She was lying on her back among burnt-out grass about 30 minutes from the road. Her face was turned to the right, and her left leg was laid over to her right. Her left arm was pressed against the side of her body, while her right was flung out on an angle of about 75 degrees. She was headless, shoeless, and her coat was missing. Although there were scratch marks and some bruising on her neck, there were no footprints around the body, nor any signs of violent struggles. The first thing that struck Dr. J. Friedman, the Johannesburg strict surgeon, when he arrived on the scene of the crime, was the position of the body. From the way Bubbles was lying, it appeared that she had been placed carefully on the ground, which suggested that she had been murdered nearby and then carried probably over the shoulder into the plantation. This assumption was substantiated by the fact that although both of the victim's shoes were missing, there was neither grass nor soil on the soles of her feet. She certainly had not walked to the spot where her body was discovered. The bodice of the green dress she wore was slightly ripped and the button was missing. The lower right leg of her stocking was also snagged in a number of places. Her panties were torn on the right side, but her black petticoat and her black brassiere were intact. The post-mortem revealed that she had been sexually assaulted. In her mouth were some pieces of a hard clay-like material. Although some of the bits lay deep in her throat, there were no particles in her lungs, proving that the clay had been forced into her mouth after death. Dr. Friedman examined the contents of Bubble's stomach. The extent of digestion of the various food particles he found was to entirely substantiate Polyak and Dolchek's subsequent account of events on the night of her death. A highly significant fact that emerged during the post-mortem was that Ms. Schroeder was suffering from a condition of the thymus gland, which would have caused her to fall unconscious very quickly from one slight pressure around the neck. The bruising on her neck indicated that she had been strangled from behind, probably by a scarf or something similar, and had scratched herself in an effort to tear the ligature from her throat. Dr. Friedman concluded the cause of death was asphyxia, an inhibition due to pressure on her throat and the impaction of hard clay-like substance, similar to that in a heap of builder's lime a couple of meters away in her hypopharynx. He estimated that the time of death as around 2 o'clock on the morning of Tuesday, 16 August. The police launched a large-scale search in the area around Birdhaven Plantation, but without success. However, on 13 October, almost 2 months after the murder, Hyman Liebman and David Polyak were arrested in connection with the murder of Bubble Schroeder. They appeared in court the following day and were remanded in custody. Later, they were granted bail of £5,000 and $500 respectively. Their trial began a few days later at the Johannesburg Magistrates Court. The evidence which the police presented to the court was almost entirely circumstantial. The prosecution based its case upon the fact that Liebman and Polyak had been with Ms. Schroeder late on the night of her death. There was no direct evidence to suggest that either of the two men were connected in any way to her murder. However, and eventually, they were acquitted. So who did kill Bubble Schroeder? The police contended that Liebman had strangled her in his car using a scarf. This was after he had driven her to Birdhaven Plantation and attempted to have sex with her. When she fell unconscious, he had carried her body away from the road, but there was not a shred of evidence apart from the fact that Liebman did give her a lift in his car to support this claim. A second theory was Bubbles was robbed and killed by a passing African. This hypothesis is supported by the fact that her mouth was stuffed with lime. Among certain African peoples, it is customary to place something in the mouth of a victim who has suffered a violent death to prevent him or her from speaking ill of the killer in the afterworld. But this theory has a number of obvious weaknesses. For example, if the motive for the crime was robbery, why was Bubbles killed? And why was the body so neatly laid out? A third and possibly the most plausible answer was advanced by the Benjamin Bennett, who was the crime writer of the Argus at the time. Bennett suggested that Bubbles probably tried to hitch a lift home and was picked up by the passing motorist. If there had been two men in the car, the passenger would have moved into the back so that Bubbles could have the front seat. The man in the back was in perfect position to put a scarf around her neck to restrain her, and she was accidentally asphyxiated. Afterwards, her body was carried into the nearby plantation and dumped. Lime was put into her mouth simply to confuse the police into thinking that the crime had been perpetrated by an African. All this is mere conjecture. However, and we are still left with the question of who killed Bubble Schroeder, it seems unlikely that the truth will ever be known. On the morning of November 23rd, 1977, Daniel Shabalala knocked on his boss's door. Receiving no answer and finding the door unlocked, let himself in. Once inside, he quickly came across Robert Smith's body and found Gianna Cora Smith's bloodied corpse slumped over on the telephone in the lounge. Without taking in too many of the gory details, Shabalala ran outside to alert a neighbor. The Smith murders in November 1977 sent shockwaves through apartheid-era South Africa because the hit was carried out against an up-and-coming National Party politician, apparently in the orders of someone at the top of the Afrikaner establishment. Even today, there is no clarity about who ordered the hit or the motive, up until the point. Afrikaner nationalism had been a united family, says James Mayberg, the editor of the Politics Web, a South African news site. But now you had a situation where members of the family were prepared to go as far as brutally murdering one of their own, and his wife. The scene that greeted police on November 23rd was straight from a horror film. Robert had suffered 3 gunshot wounds, 2 to the head and 1 to the chest, and a stiletto knife was plunged into his back. Gianna Cora had been killed by one of the 2 gunshots, but her body had been further mutilated by 14 stab wounds. The words Rautem were sprayed in red paint across the kitchen walls, fridge and freezer. Only Robert's briefcase was gone, and the neighbors didn't hear or see anything. Although there is little hard evidence either way, Mayberg says that if he were to put money on it, he'd say that the person who carried out the hit was not necessarily the same person who did the writing and stabbing. His guess, someone who came in afterwards to make a cold-blooded assassination, looked like the work of a lunatic. Robert Smith attended Oxford in a Rhodes Scholarship, earned a PhD in economics, and was South Africa's ambassador to the International Monetary Fund in Washington between 1971 and 1974. Upon his return to South Africa, he was appointed head of Santam International, a front, whose role was to circumvent sanctions and thus acquire international products of a strategic nature of South Africa, writes Chris Constant in Unsolved, No Answers to Heinous South African Crimes. When he was murdered, Smith was just days away from what promised to be a glittering political career. His seat as a Member of Parliament of Springs was virtually assured, and the talk was that he would soon be appointed the finance minister. There was little doubt that the secrets in Robert Smith's brown briefcase had held the key to the mystery, writes Carsten. One theory was that the briefcase contained a document destined for Prime Minister John Vorster himself, purportedly to do with the clouds gathering around the Department of Information. What it revealed is anyone's guess, but the Smith murders were in the Mayberg's opinion. The unanswered question that ran through the information scandal that ultimately resulted in Vorster's resignation in 1978. Over the years, the number of names have been associated with the case, and most of the rumors concur that regardless of who actually carried out the hit, it was likely authorized by Hendrik van der Berg, the commander of the notorious Bureau of State Security, South Africa's intelligence agency, who once stated that he had enough men to commit a murder if he told them to kill, and he didn't care who his prey was. In 2006, the National Prosecuting Authority of the post-apartheid government publicly named the suspects, 2 boss operatives and 1 a member of a police task squad. Phil Freeman and Dries Verwey were both long dead by then, but the 3rd suspect, named only as R.A., was widely acknowledged as being Roy Allen. He is believed to be alive and well living in Australia. No charges have been brought against Allen, and he has even written a piece of Politics Web, giving his theory about who the killers might have been. The fact that the crime took place in the Smiths' home and involved the killing of both husband and wife has led many to believe that the foreign assassins may have carried out the hit. It is hard to believe that Boss Hardman could have been persuaded to kill John Cora, and various former boss operatives have said that the crime scene did not bear hallmarks of a boss hit. One theory, which in Mayberg's opinion has been unexplored, is what Joe Tranter described in the February 1980 edition of Delaware's Wilmington Sunday News Journal, that a hit team of Cuban tourists trained and recruited by the CIA was being used to carry out the murders. Trento's article was primarily concerned with the Cuban death squads, links to assassinations carried out by General Pinochet's notorious Dirección de Inteligencia Nacional in Chile, which often killed husbands and wives, but it did not mention, almost in passing, that the squad's victims included a South African economist and his wife, who were shot to death in their South African home in 1977. Although it's hardly surprising that the crime was not solved while the nationalist government was in power, the case is one of the very few from that era that remains completely unsolved. Even today, there are many amongst the older generation of Afrikaners, not to mention the Smith's children, who were 15 and 13 at the time when their parents were killed, who would love to get to the bottom of it. I've always looked for proof of a hypothesis, says Mayberg, who feels there is probably something in the files in Chile or Washington that could allow one to make a connection. Maybe your readers in the US will help us find it. He once said, hopefully.